tonight I'm extremely happy and honoured to be here with you and to try to talk to you about your writing, about performative philosophy as literary method and style, and perhaps also as embodied female life. I feel I want to talk about everything, but a talk is also short. The plan now is that you will start by reading a piece called Literal Madness from your latest work, and then we will enter into conversation. So,
yeah.
Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Jenny. That's the plan, and thank you so much. The Scum Manifesto really did something for me too. That was a very, very important book. And the work I'm going to read from now, I'm writing a critical biography of the American writer Kathy Acker, who I think when people talk about I Love Dick, now 20 years after it was first published, they don't make the connection, especially when they're talking about female writing, autofiction, the use of the first person. I'm always amazed that people don't connect it to Kathy Acker's work, which was a huge influence on me when I moved, especially her early writings. When I moved to New York, before she'd been commercially published, her writings were circulating as self-published zines and as small press books, and they went straight to my heart. And for this and other reasons, as the years went on, I felt that I had to do something about her life and work. And it was a project I started in 2000, and then abandoned and did other things, and around 2012 I came back to it. So I'm going to read the epilogue of the book now, and because Gothenburg appears in it, I just couldn't resist reading that part here. It's called Literal Madness, and it's the part after she's dead and all the friends are kind of squabbling and fighting about what to do with the ashes. It's a familiar story. It's a very contemporary story. Literal Madness. Like everything in the past, everyone remembers it differently, and some of the people involved hardly remember it all. We're talking about something that happened more than 17 years ago. But on January 23rd, 1998, which was a Friday, friends of the late writer Kathy Acker drove from San Francisco to Fort Funston Park, about 25 minutes away, to scatter her ashes. She'd died 2 months before at an alternative clinic in Tijuana, where she received palliative care for late-stage metastasized cancer. The ash scattering, like the wake at Bob Gluck's house on December 13th, and the memorial reading at Slim's Bar, where Michelle Handelman recalls being booed off the stage, devolved into a kind of black comedy, the way these things often do. At Jackie Curtis's memorial, I remember Cookie Mueller standing up on the stage at La Mama, halfway through an evening of readings and monologues, blinking back tears as she faced the auditorium. She had no speech prepared. I thought this was supposed to be a funeral, she said to the room, not a variety show. Speaking to Silver Lochinger, the artist Steve Brown recalled how the elegantly planned Neanderthal suicide of danceteria MC Howie Montaghi among a small group of friends ended with a plastic bag over his head. He was a large man in the late stages of AIDS, and whoever arranged for the pills underestimated the dose. Before time accelerated, deaths among friends in the art world were like salt to a sting, bringing unresolved feuds to the surface. Now we care less, or are nicer. Around this time last year, when I started working on what may or may not be a biography of Kathy Acker, I imagined beginning the book with a melee at Slim's Bar, or the wake where a group of friends gathered to transfer her ashes from a box to an urn, or the scattering. To describe these proceedings would be to stage an establishing shot of a movie that uses a single protagonist to traverse an entire milieu. Although she wrote first-person fiction and gave hundreds of interviews in which she was asked to recite the facts of her life over and over, these facts are hard to pin down in any literal way. Acker lied all the time. She was rich, she was poor, she was the mother of twins, she'd been a stripper for years, a guest editor of Film Comment magazine at the age of 14, a student of Herbert Marcuse. She lied when it was clearly beneficial to her, and she lied even when it was not. Perceptive readers of Acker's work have observed that the lies weren't literal lies, but more a system of magical thought. Acker's life was a fable, and to describe the confusion and love and conflicting agendas behind these memorials would be to sketch an apocryphal allegory of an artistic life in the late 20th century. It is girls from which stories begin, she wrote in her last notebook, and like other lives, but unlike most fables, it was created through means both within and beyond her control. By the time Acker died at age 50, she'd known thousands of people. Since her divorce from her second husband, Peter Gordon, in 1979, she'd had no long-term partner. She'd lived at different times in her life in San Diego, San Francisco, New York, and London, a half-conscious rotation of cities familiar to her. I think she was just always trying to find her community, the technology writer Are You Serious told me last year at a Mill Valley cafe. Michael Bracewell, who'd known her in London during the mid-1980s, concurred. She bought, then abandoned, an apartment in Brighton. Her friend Gary Pulsifer doubts she ever spent a night there. Estranged from her remaining immediate family, she'd known poets and bikers, leather dykes, tattooists, philosophers, astrologers, artists and writers, bodybuilders, psychics, promoters and editors, and she slept with a great number of them. In London, she played chess with Salman Rushdie. She'd lived in San Francisco between 1990 and 96, teaching a class in new genres at the Art Institute, while trying to find a more stable tenure-track job anywhere in the U.S. In San Francisco, she worked out at Gold's Gym, published 2 novels, toured constantly, recorded CDs, and added an enormous, impressive tattoo across her shoulders and upper back to the series of pictographs already inscribed on her body. Literal madness. Images written not just as words on the page, but as pictures on flesh. The tattoos, an enormous lizard-like fish overlaid with a garland of flowers that morphs into a sleek airborne bird, was done in the style of Ed Hardy, and it took weeks to complete. Her friend Kathy Brew recalls Acker coming into her office in the humanities department after each session and asking, "Honey, would you put some cream on my back?" After the last session, Brew grabbed her camera and took a much reproduced photo of a bare-chested Acker astride her 6,500cc motorbike. "We were just playing around. It felt like 2 girls playing dress-up or something." Brew was newly divorced, and during those years the two hung out a lot, talking about being single, desire, and intimacy. And then in '94, Brew moved back to New York. By the time Acker left San Francisco for London in '96, she'd stopped talking to a lot of her former friends in the city's literary worlds and cyberpunk scene. With some, there'd been feuds. Others couldn't handle her medical choices and denial of cancer, which had been diagnosed in April that year. When she returned to the city in September, she was no longer closely in touch with anyone from her old, extensive, disparate circles. From a hotel, she called Aileen Mayer, an old colleague from the Art Institute. She'd known Mayer years before in New York, but in San Francisco their friendship was distant at best. Mayer recalls running into Acker holding court at parties and openings, looking into the middle distance beyond her old friend. "Oh, come on, Kathy, I know you," Mayer felt like saying. Acker told Mayer she was sick, and although by then Mayer was working full-time and caring for 2 young children, within minutes of arriving at Acker's hotel room, she had a strong feeling, "I have to be there for this." Sharon Grace, another SFAI colleague, became a key part of Acker's support system during those weeks in San Francisco, before her friend Matthias Wagner arrived from LA and arranged for her move from a medical center to American Biologics, the only alternative clinic in Tijuana that would accept cancer patients at such a late stage. They arrived with a Buddhist nurse in a rental van on November 1st, the Mexican Day of the Dead. By the time Wagner returned to San Francisco with her ashes, everyone knew of her illness and death. There'd been a fundraising drive for her clinic expenses. A few of her closest old friends had traveled to visit in Tijuana, and thousands of emails about her condition had been exchanged. A strange sonnet was posted online less than 2 weeks after her death by the Acker Society of Gothenburg, Sweden. These news are not for real. We have nothing more to feel. Death again has put us in trances, but you will always be in my dances. I cannot take much more. What on earth are we here for? You were a prostitute, some kind of whore. Kathy, you have made your final score. I'm sure somebody in this room's dad wrote this. Acker died a month after arriving in Tijuana. During the last weeks of her life, the writer and artist Matthias Viegner became her constant companion, her next of kin, overseeing her treatment at the clinic, coordinating visits from friends, and acting as a clearinghouse for all communication. Viegner traveled to see her in San Francisco after she underwent a mastectomy in April '96, and Acker's then boyfriend Charles Shaw Murray had flown in from London to be with her during the surgery. When Viegner arrived, he found Acker miserable, weak, and pissed that he hadn't come sooner. She wanted to be taken care of, but not treated as if she was sick, which he found impossible. He had a strong feeling then she was going to die. As he would write later, I knew she was going to die and how she would die, and that I would be there because I wasn't afraid of it. Or if I was, it was minuscule in proportion to her fear of it, so it was blotted out. After the mastectomy, she turned her back on Western medicine, a decision she'd eventually describe in an essay, The Gift of Disease, and a libretto, Eurydice of the Underworld. She stayed in San Francisco for 3 months after the surgery, consulting psychics, astrologers, healers, nutritionists, and a past life regressionist from Marin County. By July, her healers agreed she was now cancer-free, and she left San Francisco to live with Charmary in London as planned. 2 of the practitioners Acker consulted would later be indicted in other cases for medical fraud. However, those closest to Acker came to agree that the claims of her healers were more metaphoric than fraudulent, which was not unlike the extrapolations in Acker's first-person writings and interviews, which, if misread as literal truths, could then be dismissed as false. Acker's domestic arrangement with Charmary didn't last long. 2 months after arriving, she bought an apartment in Islington and fell sick again with an illness she ascribed to littoral poisoning. Walking with Murray on a towpath beside the Regent's Canal, she dropped her Evian water bottle into the river. He scrambled down to retrieve it, and she told herself and her readers and friends over and over again about how she'd contracted a viral infection when the polluted water seeped under the cab. She was reacting to tainted water. He'd given her poison to drink. It wasn't cancer at all. Still sick, she traveled to Virginia for a visiting writer job at a small college during the spring '97 semester. When she got back to London, she was exhausted and isolated and saw no point in staying. Viegner and others thought she should move back to California. In early September, she arrived back in San Francisco via Chicago, where she performed with the Mekons, checked into a hotel, and consulted her healers. She didn't reach out to Viegner or other old friends until mid-October. As Bob Gluck recalls, she attributed her illness to bad water. She was very constipated and instructed me to bring a certain enema. I couldn't find it, and so she didn't use the one I brought, because everything was done according to Frank Molinaro, her astrologer, and he had not authorized this one. She called him every hour or less, consulting him on every move. He passed out business cards at her funeral. Isn't that incredible? As though Kathy's fate was an advertisement for him. I gave Kathy a back massage. She was very thin. I tried to figure out what to do for her. She was in deeply serious pain, the kind of pain that makes you frantic. It seemed to me she had entered a magical world. She did not really want to associate with people outside of it. When she finally called Viegner, he offered to drive up and bring her back to his house in LA to get her bearings. But when he arrived, he saw she was clearly too sick to be moved. He, Mira, and Grace convinced her to go to a hospital where doctors confirmed that the cancer had spread to most of her body. I don't understand, she told Viegner. I have cancer everywhere. My healers told me I had no cancer. When I asked my master healer, the teacher of all the healers, he told me he saw no cancer because I would not let him see cancer. He can only see what I let him see. So teachers are mirrors. Her body was cremated at the Funeraleria del Carmen in Tijuana, and somehow Viegner, who was now her executor, transported the ashes across the border in a sealed aluminum tin. The question became what to do with them. Acker left no instructions because she did not want to die. She'd only been coaxed into writing a will when the question of what would become of her work was posed as a hypothetical game. A flurry of emails passed between him and Ira Silverberg, Acker's former agent and friend. A mutual friend had offered his garden, but that didn't seem right. Let X find other fertilizer for his garden. You should do as you please, Silverberg wrote. I still think a little in San Francisco, London, and NYC would be nice, he proposed, not unreasonably. A few miles away from the clinic, people continued to visit the gravesite of Juan Soldado, a dubious folk hero whose remains are interred where he was shot by a firing squad in 1938. Candles and stones, bracelets and pennies and figurines. Thank you, Juan Soldado, for bringing my son. Thank you for granting my immigration. Thank you with all my heart for the protection you gave me in my hour of anguish, the small engraved plaques and handwritten notes say. I'm writing this essay in Punta Banda, about 80 miles south of the border, although nominally I live in LA. Born and raised in Auckland, New Zealand, the artist Simon Denny now lives and works in Berlin. His partner, a curator, is Italian. In Mexicali, an enormous mural in Centennial Square by Carlos Ortega Corona is protected by 24-hour guard. The painting, A Fertile Century, is an homage to the native Cocopah Indians and the perpetual struggle for water and land. Corona, a veteran of Mexicali's 68 movement, has been at odds with his government's institutions all his life, but the mural is valued. I was taught, writes Marco Vera, a Mexicali critic and cultural activist, that the concept of a local artist is a noble one, that to live and work in a community and to be known for that work is very dignified. The idea of a national art is as anomalous as the border. Contemporary artists are Greek or Estonian or Australian or South African born, leaving those places for international cities to launch their careers in their late teens or early 20s. To remain in one place is either privation or luxury. No one I know who's died in my lifetime, no matter their age, has been interred in a grave. No matter how loved or accomplished or distinguished these friends have been, there are no scholarship funds in their names, no plaques, no memorial benches or arches. The reasons for this, I suppose, have been detailed in books like Robert Powell's Bowling Alone, but I still find it hard to accept. Where to inter the remains of those who live in perpetual transience? He divides his time between New York and Maine, between Berlin and LA, between Jakarta and Sydney, the bios all say. Why not the ashes? In San Francisco, Viegner and other friends found a French Beaux-Arts vase in an antique shop that would serve as an urn. A decision was made to hold a memorial wake at Bob Gluck's home on Friday, December 13th. People would speak, and there'd be a ceremony to transfer the ashes from the can to the vase. The dining room table would be used as an altar, and Shepard Hall, a Buddhist practitioner and longtime partner of the poet Diane de Prima, would be asked to preside. 17 people gathered that night at Gluck's home. Powell led the group in a meditation, breathing in fear, confusion, and chaos, breathing out calm and peace, and then he recited a Tibetan chant for her spirit's release. There was a publicity headshot on the altar, some lilies, and a little stuffed dog. As Kevin Killian recalls, the house was filled with New Agey type people who had helped Kathy in her last year. Tattooists, bodybuilders, motorcycle girls, SM practitioners, herbalists. It was almost like an upstairs-downstairs thing. Kathy had hired most of these people at one time or another. They were the service people, I thought snobbishly, but very few artists or writers who were her peers. The ritual had this creepy otherworldliness to it, the sacredness, Jodie Bellamy would write in her diary the next day, as if Kathy were behind the scenes directing our movements, and people were shedding real tears. Kathy's chosen truly loved her, nice people. A young Amazonian woman named Juliet, who knew Acker from the gym, cut open the can, and then people were asked to approach the altar alone and commune with the ashes by scooping a cup into a vase. Bellamy couldn't do it. Killian dipped 3 fingers into the jar and licked them off his hand. Ingesting her ashes was a symbolic means of reincarnating some of the dead hero's genius. He'd done it before with his friend Sam D'Alessandro's cremains. Viegner was horrified, but then he did it too. As he'd later write, what hit me most was that Kay would have no choice about whom her ashes inhabited. Whatever the meaningless relation between ashes and human, some choice was made available again. My first decision as her literary executor. Although mostly Aileen Mayer recalls, it was messy. It worked best, she emailed last week, with a paper cone. Viegner selected the Fort Dunstan Park site because he remembered how much Acker loved walking there. A short drive south of the city, the park has a spectacular view of the open Pacific. Wide paths dotted with wind-dwarf cypress and junipers cut over the bluffs. At the park's deepest point is a 200-foot drop to the waves. People arrived at the park that afternoon in separate cars. It was a smaller group than at the memorial. Acker's friend, the editor Amy Shoulder, had flown in from New York. Aileen Mayer and Sharon Grace were both there. Bob Gluck, Viegner, Shepard Powell, and the astrologer Frank Molinaro. As people got out of their cars and assembled, Molinaro passed out business cards. The general plan was to release the ashes into the sea, although Shoulder wondered about this because she recalled Acker feared drowning. But then again, as Viegner recalls, she was afraid of death, period, in any concrete way, although it runs through all of her work. The group took a steep, sandy path down one of the dunes, and Viegner carried the urn. Aileen Mayer recalls Shepard Powell reciting De Ante Prima's poem Litany to Kathy Acker, the chief written in response to Rudolph Giuliani's attempt to shut down the Sensation Show at the Brooklyn Museum because of Chris O'Feely's painting The Holy Virgin Mary, which was splattered with elephant dung. Our Lady of Mandrake, Our Lady of the Bayou, Our Lady of Subways, Our Lady of Blind Cats, Our Lady of albino alligators, Our Lady of Desperados, our 300-pound lady who sits on stoops in a house dress in the summer night, Our Lady of Tenements. Although in a literal sense this seems unlikely, because the exhibition wouldn't open in Brooklyn until October 1998, but in any event it is a great poem. As the group scrambled down, Viegner and Shoulder paused to wait for the others, and Frank Molinaro, the odd one out, the one nobody liked in this group, rushed up and grabbed the vase out of his hands. The astrologer ran towards the sea, tossing handfuls of ash and bone while he proclaimed, "You're free, Kathy, you're finally free," before Viegner and Shoulder wrested it back. It was bitterly cold, and no matter how hard they tried, no one could toss the ashes into the waves because the wind blew them back. It hardly felt final. Viegner and Shoulder waded into the sea with the final cremains. After that, everyone trudged back up the dune and drove to the beach chalet bar up the road to talk and have drinks.
Okay.
The first thing that I notice about this text is how it is populated by many. There are people passing by, people saying things, thinking and doing things, people caretaking, mourning, arguing and witnessing and going for drinks at the end. All these people are in different ways connected to Kathy Acker's singular body and body of work. this to me seems quite characteristical of the way you write, that there's an intense interest in relations and context, both social and aesthetic. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely, I agree. I would say one of the people that really influenced me before I started writing the most was the poet David Ratche, whose prose book I published with Semiotext. I was working on the book shortly before I wrote I Love Dick, and I really feel like in some and he died right after the book came out, and I felt like, you know, in some way I Love Dick was some kind of transmission of David. But he wrote these incredibly beautiful poet essays, and the way that I would most describe them is like the essay is a room with all the windows wide open so that ideas can float in and out. And that became my image for the ideal text, you know, a large room where things can circulate freely. And, you know, in this case, it's the voices of the people that I talk to. I didn't know all of them before, but everybody I either sat across and talked to and had direct communication with. Some of them, like Matthias, I've known since 1995 when Kathy died, 97. So yeah, I mean, when I read the text, I really do feel like I'm bringing these people along with me.
You're also someone who has worked, you're interested in people and in context, but you're also someone who has worked with changing context in a way, working with creating this Native Agent series. Could you say something about this work and what it's like for you, what it's meant to you to work as a publisher and editor?
Yeah. It's a beautiful story. I think maybe, you know, kind of things always happen in two steps, right? When the Native Agent series was actually happening in the 90s, no one paid it much mind. I mean, a few people. There were some women in the art world that bought all the books. And the books, I've met people who read the books in the 90s, and the books were very important to them. But in a larger way, it hardly made a ripple in the culture. In fact, a lot of people thought that it was kind of defiling the purity of the French theory that Semiotext published, you know? A lot of people were very critical of Semiotext for publishing, you know, these kind of messy women. It was really only, I think, like later, around the mid-aughts, when a lot of women started blogging and picked up on these books from the 90s, that it kind of was dragged into the present. And like I Love Dick, but the whole series kind of was given a context. And suddenly the idea of a public eye, of women climbing the public eye, it started to make sense to a lot more people. So, the work was there, and we kind of packaged it in the series, but I think it also took like the next half generation of women to pick it up and rediscover it, to really claim it as a context.
So that's how you work. The work was there, and you picked it up. You didn't ask people to write these texts?
No, of course not. Of course not. These were my friends, and they had books. These were my friends, and they needed their books to come out. And at the time, Semiotext had a certain prestige in the art world, and I thought if I could talk Sylvia into publishing my friends, it would help get their work out. That's how most things start, right?
Yeah. Context in your writing is always connected to materiality. Class, gender, money, careers, living quarters, etc. Money is explicitly present in your writing, which in my view separates it from a lot of other writing on, for instance, art and desire, and from a lot of talk in literary rooms like the one we're in now. I thought about that when I was separating, for instance. I was very worried about how to get a new flat, and so some of my friends thought that this was very banal. I should be worrying only about heartache and emotions. But in your books, these kind of things are always interconnected. The material circumstances are part of the emotions, and you insist on bringing actual money into the conversation, don't you?
Always.
Yeah. And why is that? Is that like part of a... it's part of a Marxist analysis, of course, but...
Yeah, to say yes, that would be the kind of rhetorical means of describing it, Marxist analysis. But I also believe that's the true analysis.
Yeah.
I mean, I deeply believe that money and economic and class circumstance is a much more powerful definer of our lives than, our gender identity, our sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. And it's the thing that's least talked about. And it's the kind of dirty secret, of course, of the literary and art world. All these people, fresh out of art school and university, kind of bouncing around with no visible means of support for the next 10 years trying to establish their careers. And people assume that just happens. Well, obviously it's no visible means of support because their families are supporting them. And it leads to a very limited view of the world and culture that eventually makes its way into literature and into critical discourse and art. And it's very unfortunate. And this becomes more and more true. I mean, to the extent where people feel this terrible sense of personal failure if they can't support themselves sheerly by their artwork or their writing. But nobody can. And the people who pretend to have, if you're not Stephen King, the people who pretend to be doing this really do have a spouse who's supporting them, or family money, or private income of some kind.
But do you feel that you are one of few people who actually bring money into the game?
It's not yeah. I mean, especially now, it's become, sexuality is like so, there's no taboo in terms of sexuality. Pornography is everywhere. But I think the conversation about class and money has become even more circumspect. People are more repressed about talking about that than they were, a century ago, even 30 years ago.
She created a position from which to write, you say about Kathy Acker in the text you read. And so did you in I Love Dick, your first novel from 1997, and we're all very excited that it's finally coming out. It's coming out in Swedish now, translated by Anneli Axén. And since I read I Love Dick, and since I started reading your work, I often think to myself and say to myself and others, Chris Kraus made me do it in a kind of way. But what made you do it? What made you turn the letters of I Love Dick into a book?
Well, David Ratchey made me do it.
Okay.
And to a lesser extent, reading Kathy Acker when I was young made me do it. There's always kind of, a literary, there's an impetus in life, but if you're writing a literary work, I think there's also an impetus through a literary kind of precursor, a kind of energy that gets carried, that's the magic, right? That a book can kind of make its way and affect people that you don't even know, and maybe not until years later. But yes, the circumstances were ripe, but I think the most powerful influence was like having worked on David's book, and then the fact that he died. And also knowing that Kathy Acker, who, we were never friends. I didn't even like the second half of her body of work that much when she started cranking out novel after novel to maintain her image. But I found always the example of her very touching, and I was extremely affected by the way things were at the end, the way she died, pretty much alone in Tijuana. And as Kevin said, being surrounded by like service people, she had no peers. She kind of killed off all the women peers.
I Love Dick in Sweden is obviously a huge deal for some of us here. And when I was preparing this talk, I was thinking that a good method to try to talk not only about I Love Dick, but about your whole body of work is to use a few quotes from I Love Dick that I think maybe say something central about all your writing, also beyond I Love Dick.
Okay.
So I'm going to try some of these quotes now.
This is like a game show.
Yeah, it is. The first quote is from the first letter to Dick. The first person narrator, Chris, writes, "Dear Dick, since Sylvain wrote the first letter, I'm thrown into this weird position. reactive, like Charlotte stamped to Silver's Maggie Verver, if we were living in Henry James's The Golden Bowl. The dumb cunt, a factory of emotions evoked by all the men. So the only thing I can do is to tell the dumb cunt's tale, but how? That's the end of the quote. This to me seems a very efficient starting point for Chris's letter writing, almost like an instruction to the reader. Did you think of it that way? And is this a position, the dumb cunt / heroine, that is still relevant for you?
No.
No.
I'm too old to play the dumb cunt anymore. I have to find another role. I mean, I think people are always writing through a mask or a persona, and certainly like having been married for years to someone who was 18 years older, I was always kind of playing the ingenue, you know? So when I started writing to play the ingenue, that was the role that was most easily at hand, you know? He was the professor and I was the ditzy ingenue. So that was a very easy mask to write out of. You can't sustain that mask forever. It'd be completely false and terrible. But over the years, for each book, I think I found a different mask to write through. And that's kind of why I can't crank out book after book every year and a half. It takes a while for the mask to change.
But would you say that it's right to sort of look at this quote as a kind of instruction, almost to the reader, the way you immediately turn Chris's position into a literary position, into something that has to do with Henry James rather than with, well, as well as with the situation outside literature that she's obviously in?
Right, or like, I was trying to crack a joke. The damn cunt's tale, that belongs in the Canterbury Tales. That's like Chaucer. The way to write the book was to keep cracking jokes. I mean, the only way to kind of tell this ridiculous story about obsessive love was to keep cracking jokes about it, to take it both like deeply, deeply seriously, and then not seriously at all. So yeah, that was like, taking on a persona or a character.
But
Yeah.
I mean, I never studied writing. I studied acting, and what you learn when you study acting is that the mask is very real, A bad acting is when the mask isn't real. I mean, the mask has to kind of integrate with the person to this very kind of witchy degree for the performance to be worth watching.
So you need to sort of become this mask.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel a bit strange jumping from questions to questions, but that's the way I've prepared this. But I was also thinking, in relation to this dumb cunt kind of heroine, about how sadomasochist sexual practice is present in your work, as a kind of example maybe of how structures of power and pain always are present, and this way can be revealed and given form. And that made me think about submissive and dominant positions in writing, how they are both perhaps present in writing, and how this mask that you put on in this first letter to Dick is a kind of power play, maybe?
Yeah, I feel like, I don't want to disagree.
no, but you
But-
can disagree.
Okay. I guess I always had a kind of lighter take
Yeah.
on the S&M stuff. I mean, once again, it was like playing a role. It was this kind of very boundary game, and the dominant would sort of play one role, and the submissive would play another role. But play was the operative word. It wasn't this kind of essentialist drama. That's a great difference that I'm kind of feeling as I write about Agar between her and me. She also got very deeply involved in BDSM, and as in her later work, sexuality became, in the beginning, sexuality was a kind of social comedy, but it became this very anguished kind of essentialist drama. And she was always obsessed with power and power relations between men and women. And, I came to think, years later, power is so overrated, right? Power is maybe not even that interesting. And in my second book, Aliens and Anorexia, I'm picking up on the work of the philosopher Simone Weil, and she's talking about decreation. So it's not about like gaining power, but losing power, you know, decreating the self altogether as a greater means of freedom.
I wanted to ask you about that actually, because there are two quotes in I Love Dick that for me kind of interconnect. I want to move outside the limits of myself to exercise mobility, it's one. And the other one is nothing takes me past my body. And to me these two positions seem interrelated in your work, that the combination of those two kind of tend to make a lot of things happen, that you can't go past your body, but yet you want to exercise freedom, you want this mobility, you maybe even want to actually decreate the I, as Simone Weil did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess also in a lot, I had studied Simone Weil for years before I started writing, and definitely her presence came into my first two books. Can I just answer that with a great Simone Weil quote?
Yes.
Okay. If the body is the only lever to salvation, why not use it? Use the I to break down I. And that, use the I to break down I, that seems so profound. You know, and that's kind of, I mean, to me that's a more ideal example of what first person writing can do. I mean, you know, the book has become, I Love Dick has become this more mass market kind of thing. And, you know, it's sold in like, you know, Urban Outfitters and different kind of people are reading and writing about it. And, you know, so it's taken as a kind of, you know, banner of female self-empowerment. But I never really saw it that way. I mean, I saw it as, you know, self-empowerment, I mean, escape. You know, use the I to break down I, to get rid of yourself altogether.
I mean, that's very obvious in the book. It's also in the way you use narration. You switch between different styles. I mean, the I is constantly changing as well. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, as it should. I mean, you keep, as you move around looking at different sides of a question, you pick, and of course the I's always changing. Yeah.
Another quote.
Okay.
Is that analogous to a thing that poets do?
Definitely, yes. I mean, I like to think that the poetic I is just like, it's just a word. It's just like an empty container that you can fill.
Right.
So even within a single poem?
Oh yes, definitely, yes. You can make the I move.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a poem. You should. Politics. Why do I do this? Hello? Politics means accepting that things happen for a reason. And if I couple this quote with, who is making your life possible, I want to scream, from Aliens and Anorexia. This seems to be a question that echoes strongly but discreetly through all your work. Perhaps most acutely in your use of the question, who gets to speak and why? And that kind of makes me think, is all your work really about empathy or solidarity, perhaps?
Yeah, I like that word a lot. Like that I started in London on this trip and talking to people in the UK in different cities. That word seems to be having a really great comeback, the word solidarity.
Really?
Yes, a lot of people were using that word. And radical empathy, I mean, I think that's a word I made that up, maybe I borrowed it from somebody else, but that's how I would describe a lot of my writing. In Aliens and Anorexia, when I write about Paul Tech, the artist, and Simone Weil, it's a matter of like seeing how close I can come to their internal experience. And even like when I write about art, I'm always kind of trying to figure out the work from the inside and kind of like tap into the process that the artist went through to get to where he or she gets to in the art. Yeah, so it's definitely about kind of piggybacking on somebody else's ride.
But is it also, I'm thinking about Summer of Hate now. Would you say that that book is about solidarity as well? The solidarity between Kat and Paul, the two protagonists?
I mean, I think you have to understand that empathy isn't altruism. Empathy is greed. Right? Empathy is just greed for more experience, to want to have more life than your own one life. Summer of Hate, really the protagonist is Paul Garcia. And I don't know if people in this room are familiar with that book, but I wrote it. It came out in 12, but I was writing it, I guess, between 09 and 11. And it was set in the mid-aughts, around 05, 06, in the Southwest during the height of the Bush years and the invasion of Iraq and the reinforcement of the US-Mexican border. And the protagonist, Paul Garcia, is just getting out of prison for these kind of very petty drug and alcohol-related offenses when the art world character, my character that has to be there, or none of you would ever read the book, meets him in Albuquerque. And for me, it became the challenge. Well, I mean, I was miserable during those years living in the art world in Los Angeles. I felt really like a Nazi collaborator. And the degree of silence in the art world about what was happening, I mean, in all the kind of major, art, where I'm art in America, it was repugnant. It was repugnant. I mean, anyone who was doing any activist work was completely ignored in the mainstream art world, and instead, let's write another essay about the Situationists. If they were French and they did it 50 years ago, great. So I definitely wanted to shed a light in this book on things that were happening with with mass incarceration in the U.S. But because this was a real person who I came to know and care for, that became a way into another culture. And what amazed me most about his experience as I got to know him more intimately as a person was the difference in our cultural histories and what that does to your vocabulary and your perception. I am a person of tremendous culture. I put myself around culture from a very young age. Paul Garcia grew up in the southwestern U.S., never traveled, was only exposed to kind of mass culture, very intelligent person, but he had no references and no associations and no sense of context or continuum or history. And so I tried to write the book in a blunt and non-associative language. I mean, it was purely chronological. A flashback, to have flashbacks and flash forwards the way I do in my third novel. Flashbacks are associative. And associative, that means that you have a culture and a reference outside yourself. But to have that extreme poverty at a cellular level, like a mental poverty, where you don't associate your experience to anybody else's, I wanted to tap into that.
Was that difficult?
Yeah.
I mean, that novel is very different, I think, to your other work. Of course, there are things about it that I recognize, I mean, themes, etc., but it's also extremely different in the way it's written, and obviously it has to do with Paul a lot. Yeah.
It was not well received.
No?
It was more criticized than praised when it came out. Now, though, a lot more people are talking about mass incarceration as a real problem, and maybe in a couple of years people will take another look.
You seem to be always ahead of your time. That's your problem as a writer.
Right, it's heartening. It's heartening.
Another I Love Dick quote. My personal goal here, apart from anything else that may happen, is to express myself as clearly and honestly as I can. So in a sense, love is just like writing. In many senses, I have always felt that love is the opposite of writing, the very opposite of expressing myself clearly and honestly. Is this what you're proposing here, or what Chris in the book is proposing here? Isn't this a very radical and risky way of acting in a love relationship?
Wow, that's such a big question.
Yeah. But it's important for me to know.
Okay. Well, yeah. Love is intimacy, right? Love is the experience of when suddenly all the thoughts that you're thinking are directed toward that other person, because you believe that other person is going to understand you better than anyone else in the world. I mean, that's an extremely narcissistic part of love, is that we want to be understood, and somehow the loved person we believe understands us better than anyone else. And so, yeah, that does lead towards you want to express yourself as fully as possible. I mean, it's this chance to be seen and heard. Do you not agree? Okay, how do you see it?
No, you want to play tricks and hide and not be clear and honest because you want to seduce the other person.
You want to what?
Seduce.
You want to seduce the other person. Yeah, but, oh, okay. But isn't that revelation a part of the seduction?
Oh,
The dance of the
maybe.
seven
Maybe.
veils.
Yeah. Finally, you're. Yeah. Okay. Maybe. Well, I think it's an opportunity to think about, for me, to think about love in a different way, and to also think about it as just like writing. Because I do agree that writing a lot of the time is about trying to express yourself as clearly and honestly, but I've never sort of made the parallel to love.
Well, to try and give a less frivolous answer to that question, I guess I should bring Sylvain into the conversation. You know, Sylvain, who I was married to, Sylvain Lojinger, who appears throughout the book I Love Dick, and who collaborated on some of these love letters. He and I had a very special relation that was much more about intellectual companionship than any of the other traditional values of a marriage. And, that's what made writing the book possible. I mean, in a huge way, the book came out of the cocoon of intellectual companionship that we created with each other. And we were reading, at one point we were going to do a project called Red Love, picking up on the work of, have you ever read Alexandra Kalante?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know the book Red Love?
No.
Yeah, she published that book, and eventually she was exiled and everything, and it didn't go well, but kind of in the early Leninist years, she published a book called Red Love about how, domestic and sexual relations within Bolshevism would be completely different and not necessarily monogamous, and that it opened up entirely new possibilities for, yeah.
And you were gonna.
Well, we were going to do some kind of I remember somewhere in my papers there was a grant proposal. Sylvain, no one picked up on it.
Every time you try to write the truth, it changes. And that's a quote that I kind of cut, because in I Love Dick it has to do with writing in real time and editing. So it's a very literal comment on the writing process. But I'm also interested in the truth. The truth as a quality of language and as a possibility in literature. And in your work, you use all these different literary strategies and many forms: letters, transcripts, diary, travelogue, picaresque, manifesto, essay, novel, and many more. And I get kind of interested in their relations to the creation of a kind of truth. And if truth is relevant for you in your writing, is that an interesting notion, or is it
Oh, it's a vital notion. I mean, that's totally what's driving my, my writing of this book about Acker, is to tell some kind of truth about a person, and also to tell some kind of truth about parts of history that have been like horribly mythologized. All the memoirs about like how great New York was in the 80s, all this whole nostalgia fest, it's utterly disgusting, and it's nothing like the texture of life. So yeah, to tell a history that's true, that gets close to what the texture of life actually was, how competitive people actually were, how closed the society actually was, all of those things that people completely edit out. I mean, that's a big part of the project of semiotext too, is to kind of bring things back into cultural history that have been edited out. People get so fixated on these personalities, on these kind of, star figures within the culture, that they completely forgot that these people were part of a larger artistic scene, and all the other people who were part of that scene and what they did in their lives. So yes, to be as truthful as possible, it's a huge goal.
And is truth in any way connected with literary form for you?
Is truth what?
Is it in any way connected to form, literary form?
It's your form?
Form, like changing between different forms and using diary, letter.
Oh, well, I mean, no, I don't think any one form is truer than another. I love Dick switched back and forth between all those forms. But that quote about real time and revising, that was, the book wasn't entirely written in real time. The letters were written in real time. The narrative that came later, where I tell the story of Chris and Sylvain and turn them into characters, that's written as narrative. So it's a combination really between narrative and real-time writing. But real-time writing, I think that's something that I learned, the great influence for my writing was being around the Poetry Project in the 80s. And I really, I never even tried to write poetry, but I definitely learned about how to write by being around the poets.
I started thinking many things, but because emotion is just so terrifying, the world refuses to believe that it can be pursued as discipline, as form. He writes in I Love Dick. And you also quote Wittgenstein, who says, understand or die. Or you say, maybe it's Wittgenstein. And your work is a lot about pursuing emotion as discipline and about understanding emotion in a very rigorous way. But is there, in your opinion, a difference in our relationship to emotion today compared to when you wrote I Love Dick in the 90s? And also how we, or how literature and art and society pursues emotion?
No, I don't think so. I think true emotion is as radical and threatening to people now as it was then. There's a difference between kind of emoting and, talking about feelings, and there's the kind of affect of emotion, but any work that kind of viscerally expresses emotion, I think it's as shocking now as ever. It's very rare.
Yeah. Well, I would say that we live in a kind of emotional time, maybe. There's a lot of emotion around, but it's very rarely pursued as a means of thinking or as discipline.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, or maybe kind of like half, more emoticons than emotion, right?
That's true.
People definitely like talking about their feelings all the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a very, deeply felt feeling.
Or deeply thought.
Yes, or deeply examined feeling. I think a feeling only becomes itself like when it's turned around and looked at, and that's what poetry and writing does.
I think the sheer fact of women talking, being paradoxical, inexplicable, flip, self-destructive, but above all else public, is the most revolutionary thing in the world. And this is another question of the difference between maybe the 90s and now. Is to be public still a revolutionary thing for a woman, do you think? And is honesty still subversive?
Well, I think honesty is still extremely subversive. And all of these, quote unquote memoirs, about these artistic periods are so dishonest while they purport to kind of tell all. I mean, so honesty, I think, is still a very enlivening and radical thing. But as far as, women being more present in a public discourse and information about women's lives circulating, that's definitely changed to a huge degree. And that's less of an urgent problem now. I would say that, the experience, underclass experience maybe seems more drastically underrepresented in the culture than female experience.
But could it even be a revolutionary thing not to be public as a woman?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
In Summer of Hate, you write, yes. She saw no boundaries between feeling and thought, sex and philosophy. Hence, her writing was read almost exclusively in the art world, where she attracted a small core of devoted fans. Asperger's boys, girls who'd been hospitalized for mental illness, assistant professors who would not be receiving their tenure, lap dancers, cutters, and whores. These devoted fans of Cats, the writer character, the art character in Summer of Hate, are all people who in different ways are vulnerable and strange and maybe failing in some ways. Would you say that these people, or we, are the ones that your writing is addressed towards, if you have adversaries?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, of course I'm trying to crack a joke here with the character.
Yeah.
But yes, obviously. I mean, I always, you write for kind of an affinity group. And I mean, and in a huge way, a wonderful thing about starting to write was I wrote to feel less alone. And then and I started to realize that people were reading my writing. It's a wonderful thing to connect to people that way. I mean, the thing about, honesty and truth in writing is that when you read kind of more conventional literary fiction that these days has really come to resemble a mainstream Hollywood movie, nobody in the book has a life that's remotely like yours, right? They don't live in a house like yours, their job isn't like yours, they don't think like you or feel like you. And so reading the book just makes you feel even stranger and more alone. But, I mean, always the great thing about literature is that it makes people feel less alone.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, maybe I should ask you about this, because feeling less alone, it's question number 13. I'm thinking about the identificatory reading, the possibility of reading as identification with someone else, and thus feeling less alone. And ever since Madame Bovary, women have been taught that, and men as well, that identification in relation to literature is bad, even dangerous. To read should be about intellect and interpretation, not about feeling and connecting. These last two notions have been coded as escapist, or just primitive, stupid, or feminine. But in your work, you do practice an identificatory reading of, for instance, Simone Weil as a method for knowledge, right? For serious philosophical thinking.
I think the other kind of reading is stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, the other kind of reading that reads only to kind of compare and contrast and make a critical analysis, that's the kind of stupid reading because it's not really letting the work move inside you. You know, like when you remember lines from a text, when you remember lines from a philosopher, or you remember lines from a poem, it's because you've read it in such an identificatory way, you know, like reading like a girl. So people, when the book first came out, you know, people would say, "Oh, I feel like your book gave me." People that have, like, you know, in publishing, said, "Oh, I feel like your book gave me permission to read like a girl."
Yeah.
And of course, that's what everybody does and wants to do. I mean, and that's the way a book should be read, not exclusively. And it's the same. I mean, in a way, it's the same at looking at a work of visual art, you know. And people are so afraid of looking at visual art, and they don't let themselves have that primary experience of it first. They're so afraid of what they should think or should say, or, you know, what it's supposed to be about. But to just let yourself kind of have the primary experience and then place it.
But what about, is there also a risk that has to do with inclusion and exclusion? Who gets to identify with what and why? Like the question after, who gets to speak and why?
Well, I mean, that's the great, anybody can identify with everything, with anything, right? I mean, that's a secret pleasure, who you identify with.
In literature.
Yeah, and you know, movies and music and all culture.
I have 2 questions left for you. Well, you already spoke about this a little bit, but it's to do with the relationship between Kat and Paul, and knowledge and privilege. Because I'm thinking about, in this book, it's very clear that you present knowledge as a privilege, as you said before.
Yeah.
And you also present it as a way of, it influences the way you can think and the way you can write. And is this privilege what makes you able to use your method of writing, referencing other works, using them to create a weave of intertextuality? And I was thinking, is that your way of breaking out of the eye as a prison? The sort of dotting the text almost with reference and with names and art and objects and things.
Yeah, those are 2 questions.
Yeah. Okay.
And the answers are yes and yes.
Yes and yes.
Yes, it's a tremendous privilege to have access to culture. I mean, and yes, to have access to culture is a means of escaping one's own isolate misery, and to associate it, to gain access to other people in other worlds. It's a means of escape. And
but in your work, you have this way of, sometimes it's up to the reader, I find. Do you get this or not? Are you with me or not? Can you find out what I'm referring to? But sometimes, for instance, when you describe art, it's like you're leading the reader by the hand almost into the artwork, and it's very, I can't say folkbildning in English, it's educational almost. It's really opening up art for the reader. So you have like 2 different strategies?
not consciously, but that sounds kind of true. I mean, I think that like I've done both of those things in my work. But I mean, yes, I mean, not to be too evangelical about it, but certainly I've always felt that part of my work is to give other people access to the culture that I've experienced. And I mean that in terms of like high culture, having access to high culture. I mean, I always felt like I Love Dick should be like written in a way that like any girl who went to a community college could understand it, you know? Didn't have to be like a good school, because I was never, you know, meant to go to a good school. You know, I was like, you know, if we stayed in the U.S., I would have gone to a community college. But also generationally, you know, when I had the great privilege of like putting myself around some amazing people when I moved to New York City when I was 21, and, you know, and definitely it's like people sort of born in the 50s and 60s who have that experience of another culture are in a position of translating it to younger people, for sure. And I do consciously try and do that in my work. And I mean, that's part of the Semiotext project too. It's like, you know, it really kind of carries forward things from one era into another.
You said something about loneliness before. I mean, there is, I feel, in all your books, there a kind of loneliness surrounding the main characters. Even if, like in Torpor's, Silver and no, Silver. No, they're not called that. It's Sylvie and Jerome.
Sylvie and Jerome.
Yes, sorry. They are a couple, but there's two very lonely people together in this car in Europe. And I'm thinking about loneliness and feminism, because in your books there is a very radical, for me, feminist thought, but it's not automatically connected to the idea of sisterhood, that other women aren't good as such, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's never meant to be didactic in that way. And I mean, it does connect in, you know, empathically, I think. People connect empathically through different cultural things. But, yeah, I mean, it's not championing, you know, and that's not the purpose of a book. But, yeah, loneliness. I mean, loneliness is a privilege also. I mean, one of the kind of great tragedies of female experience is like having to be liked all the time. You know, that kind of girl thing where, like, you know, you're always more concerned about, like, will they like me rather than will I like them? You know, and to sort of be able to turn that around in a more aggressive way, where the question is, you know, what do I think of this rather than what do they think of me? That's a very liberating thing, but also lonely, because you're trusting your judgment. You're not kind of exposing yourself always to other people's judgment.
I'm realizing now that I was jumping, so I forgot one question, and it has to do with Torpor. I find Torpor to be your darkest book. I mean, it's very humorous, very funny in some ways, with these two clownish characters, but it's also harsh and a hard read. And rereading it before this talk, I thought of what the journey of Torpor would be like today, because this is a book where this couple are traveling around Europe, and today it would be so different. I mean, it's dark, it's a dark time. The wall has come down, and they're in Romania, and it's a very poor and difficult place for people to live in, and there's also this outbreak of civil war in former Yugoslavia. But I was thinking today the borders of Europe are closing, and there are new fences being built, and if there's a sense in Torpor that there's, at least on an individual level, this obsession with wars that have passed and with the Holocaust, now it almost seems as if there's oblivion, there's something being erased. That's at least my perception of Europe.
Yeah.
Could you say something about, I mean, do you think about this traveling in Europe now? Do you think about the difference between the Torpor time and this time?
Well, I mean, being on a book tour hasn't put me anywhere near the darker sides of Europe. That would be a different kind of travel. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I just think about this going back and forth between New York and LA now. How the tube just seems shorter. Even when I left New York in the 90s for LA, and I would go back and forth between New York and LA, it seemed like it was a great distance. But now it's like, it's the same people. You see that it's the same parties and the same people in both cities. And that's definitely like the cities that you do go to on a book tour. That's a phenomenon of Europe now. Everybody is showing up, at the art school or the venue with their black wheelie bag because they live in one city and they teach in another, and their lover or their partners in another, and everyone is sort of on the move between these centers. And yeah, I mean, when I did the travel interpreter in the 90s with Silver, who was born in 1938 and is definitely kind of another Europe, I mean, that was his obsession, to have one last trip before Europe changed forever, in the year after the breakdown of the Soviet bloc. And I mean, of course, everybody knew it would happen and it happened. So, yeah. But I mean, the whole other question of the walls and these other darker zones of Europe, that's totally present, and lots of people are working on that now. So actually, I did an interview. I was in Brussels, and the person I did the conversation with, she's working on a documentary now about like walls that are being built, around immigrant camps, etc., in Europe.
Yeah, it kind of made torpor scarier for me now, actually, than when I read it the last time. It was something. My last quote and my last question to you before you will read from my love Dick. Dear Dick, I guess in a sense I've killed you. You've become Dear Diary. Is killing Dick by writing him the only way to stay sane in the relationship with the Dicks of all our lives?
Oh, yeah. No, I don't think so. I mean, it was never a relationship with a person. I mean, the character, Chris, who was writing to Dick and I Love Dick, was not having a real relationship with a real person. I mean, that's totally different. She was having a relationship with an empty screen that eventually became a diary. That's definitely not, the prelude to any kind of real relationship. I mean, real relationships are a lot less intense.
Yeah.
and more boring.
Okay, would you like to read for us now?
Okay, yeah, just a little, like the first page of I Love Dick.
And then we can do audience questions after.
December 3rd, this is scenes from a marriage. December 3rd, 1994. Chris Kraus, a 39-year-old experimental filmmaker, and Silver Lochinger, a 56-year-old college professor from New York, have dinner with Dick Blank, a friendly acquaintance of Silver's, at a sushi bar in Pasadena. Dick is an English cultural critic who's recently relocated from Melbourne to Los Angeles. Chris and Silver have spent Silver's sabbatical at a cabin in Crestline, a small town in the San Bernardino Mountains some 90 minutes from LA. Since Silver begins teaching again in January, they will soon be returning to New York. Over dinner, the two men discuss recent trends in postmodern critical theory, and Chris, who's now intellectual, notices Dick making continual eye contact with her. Dick's attention makes her feel powerful, and when the check comes, she takes out a Diners Club card. Please, she says, let me pay. The radio predicts snow on the San Bernardino highway. Dick generously invites them both to spend the night at his home in the Antelope Valley Desert, some 30 miles away. Chris wants to separate herself from her coupleness, So she sails Silver on the thrill of riding in Dick's magnificent vintage Thunderbird convertible. Silver, who doesn't know a T-bird from a hummingbird and doesn't care, agrees, bemused, done. Dick gives her copious, concerned directions. Don't worry, she interrupts, flashing hair and smiles, I'll tell you. And she does. Slightly buzzed and keeping the accelerator of her pickup truck steady, she's reminded of a performance she did called Car Chase at the St. Mark's Poetry Project in New York when she was 23. She and her friend Liza Martin had tailed the steelily good-looking driver of a Porsche all the way through Connecticut on Highway 95. Finally, he pulled over at a rest stop, but when Liza and Chris got out, he drove off. The performance ended with Liza accidentally but really stabbing Chris's hand on stage with a kitchen knife. Blood flowed, and everyone found Liza dazzlingly sexy and dangerous and beautiful. Liza, belly popping out of a fuzzy midriff top, fishnet legs tearing up against her green vinyl miniskirt as she walked back to show her crotch. Looked like the cheapest kind of whore. A Star is Born. No one at the show that night had found Chris's pale, anemic looks and piercing gaze remotely endearing. Could anyone? It was a question that had temporarily been shelved. But now it was a whole new world. The request line on 92.3 The Beat was thumping post-riot Los Angeles, a city strung on fiber optic nerves. Dick's Thunderbird was always somewhere in her line of sight. The two vehicles strung invisibly together across the concrete riverbed of highway like John Donne's eyeballs. And this time, Chris was alone.
Thank you.
Any questions? Bring around the microphone.
I was wondering about if you could tell us.
Oh, I'm going to move around the room because I'm hearing impaired and I can only really hear your questions if I'm close. So, yeah.
Yeah, but I was thinking about if you could tell us more about your experience when you wrote the text about Kathy, because it must have been very emotional in a way when I heard you read about her.
You mean emotional for those people at the time, or emotional for me?
For you.
Well,
when you
I mean,
wrote it.
yes and no. It was emotional for me observing it in 1997.
Yeah.
It was a lot less emotional for me a year ago when I wrote the text. I mean, by then I wanted to tell it also as a kind of comedy.
Yeah.
You know, the better to bring out the pathos of it.
Yeah, I thought about the scene, and I don't know if you saw the movie Big Lebowski.
With the, oh yes, yes.
Yeah, the scene about the urn when he. I saw that in front of me. It was very.
I mean, it's just awful.
Yeah.
Awful. But I mean, that is certainly. I mean, not to make light of it, I have lost friends, a number of friends in the last 2 or 3 years, and the kind of blurriness of everything now has been so deeply upsetting to me.
Yeah.
And because everyone is so like busy and transient, there seems to be hardly any marking. You know, one of my favorite things always used to be to visit different graves and cemeteries. You know, if there was a writer or artist I love and I was in that city, I would go to that grave, and there was a place, and people would put rocks and pennies on the grave. And there's no place, and people don't know what to do anymore. I mean, there's this grief, and it has nowhere to go.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you rewrite a lot of your stuff?
Pardon?
Do you rewrite?
Oh, do I rewrite?
Yes.
Actually, with the Kathy book, I find that I'm not rewriting very much. I mean,
don't?
I've thought about it for a long time. I kind of do, on this book, I do like, it's almost like pre-production for a movie. I prepare to write a chapter, I mean, like I reread all the materials that I'm going to use, and I organize the sources, and I think about it, and I kind of transcribe diaries. I mean, I already did a big research, but then I kind of review everything, and I sit down and write it, and it's more or less the way it's going to be.
When you
So-
sketch your stories, do you do it on papers on your wall, or what do you do? Or how do you sketch? Or do you
Yeah, I do. I have a lot of stickies, and yes, I definitely put up pictures, and I put pages up, and sometimes there'll be like a piece of text that I know I'm going to use later in the chapter, and I put it on the wall, and I eventually write my way towards it. But I'm not one of those kind of great rewriters, kind of finicking over every single line. It's more like kind of getting myself into a place where I can do it right.
Are you sure when you start a story how it's going to finish?
How important?
How are you closing your story? How are you finishing it? Do you know exactly when you start?
Oh, do I know how I'm going to finish it?
Yes.
No.
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 Not.
I don't. I mean, but I always find the end somewhere. Do you know, I mean, maybe you're a writer yourself. You're asking these questions. There's that wonderful mystery of the last line.
Well, when you do crime stories, you have to.
I mean, I think everyone who writes has that, like, incredible experience of, like, discovering the last line. It's very rare that you know it at the beginning, but somewhere as you're going along, you know what the last line is going to be, and you don't know how you're going to get there.
I see. How about the first line? Everyone says that the first line is the heart.
Yes, exactly. Once you have the first line can take a year.
Yeah, but you sit and chew it then.
Yes, I totally agree. That's my
I
experience
see.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Oh. Maybe it's time for a drink.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chris and Jenny.
Thank you.
And it is time for a drink. Hang around for a while. There's wine here and there. Water also. Talk, chat, enjoy. Thank you very much once again.